Shalom Aleichem. Thank you. Okay, so we're all ready? We're ready? So we do need to know that we may not even look at any part of Pirkei Avot in this particular lesson, except for a small part, okay? We started just with some introductory material. The thing is we could spend many lessons just doing introduction to everything. That's how really important Pirkei Avot is, and the whole idea that it begins to bring across to us. We're using a couple of different books, and I'll mainly be using, at least for right now, this commentary that's put out by Art Scroll. It says Pirkei Avos, based on the Maharal of Prague. And we talked about who the Maharal was the last time we were together. I'm sorry you weren't here, Tony. It's just a very painful thing that you weren't here, that you missed all that introduction. Rabbi Judah Loew of Prague, okay? He was an amazing person. He had a particular, and much of his commentary actually follows his way of philosophy. I'm thinking to go back actually and let's see if I want to do that or not. Actually, an introduction to the Maharal. Yeah, let me just talk a little bit on some of the things the Maharal, the way he is coming across with things, okay? Because he has several words that he uses to describe the way he sees the creation and the way he sees the universe. Rabbi Tuvia Basar is the rabbi who put all of this together for us from the Maharal, from his book Derech Chaim, The Way of Life, okay? And he tells us, he says, the study of Maharal, he says, cultivates a deep, intense, and if you have the book, I'm actually in the author's introduction on XII, okay? Page 12 of the author's introduction, where it says elements of the philosophy of Maharal. And he says, the study of Maharal, which we've done a long time ago, we did some study from the Maharal on some things that are really amazing, the things that he brings out. But it says it cultivates a deep and intense and immediate awareness of God. And I think we've also found that out in some of the other great sages that we've studied. As the Maharal presents the systematic, he's a systematizer, much like the Ramchal was, even though they're not in exactly the same time period. The systematic study of the principles and the structure of existence as it flows from God, because everything is coming from Him, to mankind and to all of creation. His book, his Sefer, Derech Chaim, The Way of Life, he says, and indeed all of the works of the Maharal are better understood with the following explanations of Rabbi Judah Loew's principles. He says, I'm going to include the Hebrew terms because he continually uses these, okay? The Maharal introduces, he says, the basic elements of his system by comparing creation to the building of a house. And mainly there are four elements in the construction of a house, okay? There is a builder, poel, the worker, the one who's going to actually do the work, poel. Poel is the same word in Hebrew for it means a verb, okay? A verb does what? It's an action word, okay? So a builder, a poel, the actual physical material, which in Hebrew is chomer, like bricks and mortar. Then the architect's vision of what the house will look like, and that's tzurah, T-S-U-R-A-H, okay? Tzurah. And then the purpose of it, taklit, for which the house is built. The house would not be built if even one of those factors were absent. By the way, everything we're talking about here, because we've worked so much with Rabbi Yehuda Lev Ashlag in the area of his Kabbalistic studies, we can already see, even though he's adding one more thing here, talking about the poel, the person who actually does the work, the carpenter, in other words, he's adding this in, but we still have the same three stages that Rabbi Yehuda Lev Ashlag talks about. That thought of what Hashem wants. In other words, speaking of us as individuals, okay? That thought that he has, talking about stage one, and then he talks about stage two, where we're here, and then the construction is going on in stage two, and then we finally come to stage three, and we have the completed thing, okay? Which is the same as the thought that the Creator had in the beginning, or the architect had in the beginning. So the Maharal is actually telling us the exact same thing. He says, referring again to the metaphor of a house, the form, okay, lies in the architect's vision of the house, and it's realized in the substance of the bricks and the wood and whatever. Nothing could be qualitatively, he said, more different than those two things. One of them is just a thought, and the other is something very, very physical. All right? Yet they are inseparable, he says, for most objects. So the contrast of form, tzurah, what the architect thinks, okay, and substance, chomer, and their synthesis, he says, these are recurring themes in all of the Maharal's works, and they require some extra definition, he says. Substance, chomer, like the bricks of the house, is something physical. It takes up space. It's tangible. It's passive, though, and it accepts form. In other words, whatever you do to it, that's what it becomes. It is specific, it is finite, and it also deteriorates. Substance, he says, takes on one form at a time. Because substance can always change, it's actually never fully complete. This characteristic, he says, is called chaser. Now, something that's chaser, it actually means something that's lacking something. It's deficient. And that's the reason it's deficient is because it's not permanent. So it can always change. Form, he says, tzurah, like the architect's vision of the house, that is something that is conceptual. It does not occupy space. It isn't something you can touch. It's not tangible. It does not, by the way, accept change. All right? It has no physical limitations. It is active, and it actually spawns change, makes change by imposing itself upon the substance. It doesn't age, and it's general. One form, he says, such as a chair, has innumerable realizations in all kinds of specific chairs. All right? Since form does not change, it's not chaser, it's not deficient, it's shalem, it's complete. If you're thinking people, and I know you are, everything he's talking about here, we can plug in to what we were just talking about when when we mentioned Rabbi Ashлаг's 3, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. It's all the same thing. Anyway, he says, but we can see that the characteristics of form and substance, they are mutually exclusive. And Maharal also uses the Hebrew term called nivdal to explain that relationship. Nonetheless, form and substance, or the thought and the actualization of it, he says, are intimately bound together in every object that you find. Form is considered a higher level than substance. It constrains substance. It's universal rather than specific. For example, he says, a law has the characteristic of form because it shapes society, whereas the conduct of each individual, whether or not they're going to comply with that law, that is akin to substance, to homer. Physical material existence is the diametric opposite of spiritual conceptual existence, and I know we're not talking about Pirkei Avot yet, but we're going to find even this applies to Pirkei Avot. And creation spans the full spectrum between the two extremes of the physical and the conceptual. So success in living up to the mandates of the Torah comes through a personality that can balance all these components, he says, so that they complement each other, so that they're helping each other rather than being antagonistic against each other. Intellect, according to the Maharal, intellect, just knowing something, is actually without action, without acting on it, he says, is sterile. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't produce anything. While thoughtless action, he says, while thoughtless action, just acting without intellect, is cruel and brutish, he says. Only through intellectually directed, and this is what the Torah does for us, purposeful action can the human being mature towards a spiritual life? So now he talks about the human being, body and soul. The soul has characteristics of form. It's conceptual, it's abstract, in other words, okay? It's not something that's physical, by the way, and it's eternal because of that, because it comes directly from Hashem. It gives purpose, though, and character to the body, and the body is homer. It's just raw material. It's just substance. It's tangible, it's finite, it gives expression to the soul, and the soul is imposed upon the body just like form is imposed on any substance. Clearly, he says a human being is both a physical and a spiritual being. A person is as physical a creature as an animal. He is mortal, selfish, changeable, and dependent upon his environment. But the human being also has spirituality. He's also spiritual. And he has godly characteristics. He has awareness, creativity, self-discipline, and initiative. So, he says a human being can live at three different levels. In other words, the Maharal is going to say a human being, he's either homer, just substance, doing whatever he wants, like an animal, or the form imposed by the soul on the body has brought it to the next level, which is Tzura, okay, where he is trying to, if we think back to what the Ramchal taught us in Derek Hashem, the Ramchal says very clearly, what's the soul doing in the body? To purify the body, okay? This is the same idea. The Maharal is giving us the same idea, but now he is giving us his illustration that he wants to give us. Maybe the Maharal was also a carpenter on the side, I don't know, or maybe he built houses or was an architect. He's giving us something from the physical world that we can really see very clearly. So he's saying that a soul builds a house from the body, just like we would if we, in the physical body is just homer, it's just substance that we can use no matter what. So, but if the homer is imposing its will on the surah, on the soul, then it's just the opposite. In fact, you're not even at the level of homer. You're not even at the level of an animal. All right, you actually live lower than an animal. So here's the levels: homer, doing whatever you want with no direction. Your physical body tells you what it wants. It wants to eat more than it should. It wants to have no bounds when it comes to anything whatsoever. Whatever lust it has, it will satisfy it. Then surah, which means the soul is imposing some kind of spirituality on the body, some level of purification. And then the highest, though, is tselem. Tsel is shadow. Tselem, Betselem Elokim, the book of Genesis says, and God created the Adam, Betselem Elokim, in the image of God. Betselem, in the image, okay? So Tselem is image. At the lowest level, he says, Homer is the level of our physical existence, includes all our physical drives. The middle level is Surah. It manifests itself as the aspect of our personality that seeks to impose form and structure on objects, on other people, or on ourselves. Surah is the origin of the human drive to influence and to dominate. The faculty of speech is another example of human life at the level of Surah. But the highest level of a human being, and really you're not a human being until you get in this level, Tselem is a reference to mankind's being created in the image of God. If we consider, he says, Surah as the quality of a foot soldier, subduing opposition and enforcing allegiance, we may consider Tselem as the qualities of the king, majesty, dominion, leadership, and inspiration. By the way, this all speaks also because the Maharal was a very, very great Kabbalist, all right? You know, the Maharal, actually, stories are told about him, unbelievable stories. The Maharal is the one who made a golem, you know, in order to protect the Jews of Prague one time. And everybody knows what a golem is. Okay, all right, to protect the Jews of Prague. The actual emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire had him come to him more than once, many times, just to ask him questions about the secrets of Kabbalah. We have no idea what the Maharal told him. We just know that that happened. So when he comes to Tselem, he is talking about Malkut Shemaim, the kingdom of heaven. This is what he's meaning. So Tselem, or Tzura, he says, that's form, but Tselem is beauty. And it's associated, he said, with the radiance of life that shines in a person's face and that exudes from the independent spirit of individual existence. Okay? Now, still, we're just trying to follow the way the Maharal is thinking. All right? So he has these whole different kinds of words that he uses, but it's still Judaism. It's still the teaching from the sages on the highest level. Then he also often uses the term for intellect, sekel, okay? Smarts, intellect, concepts. That, by the way, he says, is a primary characteristic of the Torah, of an elevated human being, and indeed all spiritual entities. Sekel, he says, is spiritual, eternal, intangible, influential, and it's non-physical. In fact, he says the physical element of human existence is an impediment to exercising sekel, to exercising your intellect. Interesting. Then the Torah, he uses that with all different kinds of connotations. You have to look at the kind of context. And I don't always like blanket statements like, what the Torah is law, or the Torah is 613 commandments, or the Torah is this, or the Torah is that. The Torah is on so many unbelievable different levels that it's just, I just don't like those kind of statements. And then we have written Torah, and then we have oral Torah, and that's what we're trying to get into and study, is oral Torah, Pirkei Avot. Okay, so with these basic, though, ideas of the Maharal in mind, I think we'll better understand his commentary that he's giving to us about Pirkei Avot and what's going on with it, okay? That's just the way he is looking at things. Okay. The Maharal is from about 500 years ago, I believe. Let's see if we have an actual, date on him in here. Yes, he lived, from 1512 to 1609. Okay? He was a contemporary of Rabbi Yosef Karo, who is the author of the Shulchan Aruch. He was also a contemporary of Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, the Arizal. Okay? I've always liked him very much. He's something else. And the only reason I wanted to go over all of that is simply because those are recurring themes that you find all the time with him. Now, y'all are all so very familiar with the Ramchal. The Ramchal would use body, purification of body, and all of these things, and a soul purifying a body and going level by level up. The Maharal is giving us the exact same thing, but he's just using the illustration of building and how that goes about. That the same thing still applies to us, okay? And see, we could just be forever just to introduce these things. Let's move on to where I want to start. Where I want to start in his commentary is actually on page 9, if you have the book. If you don't, that's okay, because we're going to jump all over the place anyway, all right? When we come to Pirkei Avot that we began to introduce the last time we were together, it begins, actually also, by the way, and I'm going to read this, every chapter of this particular tractate of the Mishnah, and this is part of the Mishnah, every chapter of Pirkei Avot starts with this statement that I'm going to defer. I think the more we study Pirkei Avot, you'll see why it's there, okay? But it begins, all Yisrael has a share in the world to come. As it is said, Yeshayahu 60:21, and your people are all righteous. They are all tzaddikim, is actually what it says. They shall inherit the land forever. They are the stem, meaning the trunk. They are the trunk, okay, of my plantings. They are my handiwork in which to take pride. That starts every chapter. Okay? So we're in chapter 1, Mishnah 1. The first one, 1:1, Pirkei Avot. And it says, Moshe kibel Torah mi Sinai. We're doing it in Hebrew, right, Tony? Moses received the Torah from Sinai. Okay? Which is a way of saying he received it from God. And the last time we were together, the Maharal says, why doesn't it say he received it from God? And he says, because it's not actually fitting that we put God's name in this long list of human beings. Okay? So it's from Sinai. And then it says, Umesara li Hoshua. And he transmitted it, Mesara, okay? That's, by the way, the root of the word Mesora. He transmitted it to Joshua. And then it says, and then Yehoshua to the elders, transmitted it, okay, to the elders. And then the elders to the prophets. And then the prophets transmitted it to the men of the great assembly. And they, the men of the great assembly, said 3 things, okay? Hold on. And we're gonna back up. We're gonna read a little while, then we're gonna back up. Number 1, be deliberate in judgment. Number 2, develop many disciples. Number 3, make a fence for the Torah. Now let's go on and see what the next thing is said. Shimon HaTzadik was among the survivors of the Great Assembly. And he used to say the world depends on 3 things. On the study of the Torah, on the service, ha'avodah, on the service of God, and it's really a reference to the Holy Temple, but prayer and keeping the commandments also, and on gemilut chasadim, the performance of kind deeds, of loving kindness. All right? Let's jump. Now listen to what it says. It says, and Antigonos, the leader of Socho, received the tradition from Shimon HaTzadik. Did we catch it? Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah from Sinai. But it doesn't say, and Yehoshua received the Torah from Moshe. It says he transmitted it to Moshe. And they transmitted, and he transmitted it to the elders. And the elders transmitted it to the prophets. And the prophets transmitted it to the men of the Great Assembly. But then when we come to Antigonos, the leader of Socho, it doesn't say Shimon HaTzadik transmitted it to Antigonos. It says, and Antigonos received the tradition from Shimon HaTzadik. What's going on here? Okay. The Maharal notices it also, and he says, after using the term received in regard to Moshe, then the Mishnah uses the term transmitted for each link up to the men of the Great Assembly, and then it reverts backwards to the expression received for all of the rabbinical leaders, all of the great rabbis or sages, after Shimon HaTzadik, beginning with Antigonos, the leader of Socho. Why does the Mishnah alternate between the term receive and the term transmit? The terms received and transmitted are used to describe actually different degrees of success in transmitting the Torah at each link in the chain of the tradition. A teacher, he says, attempts to impart his knowledge in its entirety, and the student attempts to grasp that knowledge without loss. The term transmitted is used to express that the knowledge was completely transmitted. Everything that Moshe Rabbeinu received from Sinai, he gave to Joshua. And Joshua was successful in moving everything to the elders. And the elders were successful in moving everything to the prophets. And the prophets were successful in moving everything to the men of the Great Assembly. But then, there was a problem. If the student grasped less than everything that was taught, then there remains only what they got, only what was received. All right, kibel, only what was received. The Mishnah tells us that Moshe could only receive the Torah. Why doesn't it say and God transmitted it? Because God knows more than Moshe Rabbeinu. And he didn't tell him everything. Or maybe he did. But the deal is Moshe was only able to receive what he could receive. So the word transmitted is not used in receiving from Hashem. Okay. The Mishnah tells us that Moshe could only receive the Torah because it exceeds total human comprehension. But conversely, Moshe, Yehoshua, and the generations up to and including the men of the Great Assembly, they were successful in transmitting everything that they knew. Now, I know that's an unbelievable thing, but that is actually what the text is saying, just in the difference between these two little words. He says, as we'll see, the generations after that were not able to grasp all of the Torah. We lost a lot that their predecessors could teach them. Thus, the following Mishnayot, the following Mishnahs, say that the Torah was only received. Okay? So we weren't able to get everything that came from the men of the Great Assembly and from Shimon HaTzadik, the last survivor of the men of the Great Assembly. Now, I mention all that because Pirkei Avot is actually setting up, and this is something that we all need to be very familiar with. It's probably something I won't start until the next time we're together, but on how the oral Torah was actually transmitted, how it actually came down to us. It begins, and that's what Pirkei Avot is trying to tell us, it's giving us the chain. It came from God. In other words, the oral Torah, according to our tradition and our belief, you can't have the written Torah without the oral Torah. They have to go together. They're two parts of the same thing. Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch always describes the written Torah as the notes on the lecture. That Moshe was writing down notes as God was giving him the oral lecture. Okay? And that makes sense with a whole lot of things. For instance, when you come to the area of where in the world does the oral Torah come to tell us how to kosher slaughter, what all the different laws and all the different fine points of what that means. Well, that's based on how animals were actually sacrificed in the temple. But if we go to the written Torah, it never gives us step-by-step instructions on how that was done. So where did that come from? It was with the oral Torah. God did give step-by-step instructions, but the the written Torah only says what. In fact, it even says that. Actually, God tells, "And you will slaughter them there, as I have commanded you, or as I have shown you on the mount." So Hashem did show Moses all this, but it's not written anywhere in the oral Torah, or in the written Torah. Excuse me. It's not written anywhere. So it's part of the oral tradition, the oral Torah. The same thing goes with almost everything, that every aspect really of Jewish life and the fulfillment of the 613 mitzvot, the details come in the oral Torah, so much of it. And what we are studying right now is part of the oral Torah. The Mishnah is most definitely a part of the oral Torah. Okay, so what it is setting up is the chain of transmission, how it came down to us, and the men that it came down through, and what kind of people they were. What I would like to do the next time we're together is go through and track very quickly those, because they're all known different periods. For instance, the writers of the Mishnah are known as Tanaim. A Tana was a scholar, was a sage of the 1st and 2nd century, okay? And then we have a different group of sages that come after that, and a different group after that, and they all have different titles. So it would be helpful to you to learn the titles, okay, so that you can have a general idea of what period of time we're referring to and all of that. And that's what we'll do when we start the next time. Is that okay? Okay. And then eventually, promise, we'll actually study some of the things in Pirkei Avot. And because they are very, very applicable, I think that's a word, to us today. Or if you say it West Texas, it's applicable. Right, okay. But they very much are something that we need to know, and need to know in order to live, in order to serve God, in order to actually also be in touch with ourselves, okay? And I think you'll be amazed at the things that are there and how good it is. So that's what we'll do the next time. We'll start with a little study of the different eras of the transmission of the oral Torah, and then we will get into Pirkei Avot. I promise. Bli neder, without taking a vow. Okay, I'll do my best. We'll put it that way. Okay. All right. So we'll stop right here, and then we'll start again. Okay? So shalom aleichem, shalom uvracha, peace and a blessing. Bye-bye. Starter? Nod. Okay. Okay, shalom aleichem. Okay. We're going to do our very best to jump right into it. We're still studying Pirkei Avot, and we've looked at just this idea of how the oral Torah was transmitted, the Torah Shebe'al Peh, how it came down. I want to turn now, very quickly, to Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan. And none of you have this book in your hand, I'm sure. But you have it, it's on your shelf, but you don't have it in your hand. And if you get up to get it, so you're going to... Now you're going to get in a lot of trouble, Glenn, I'm telling you.
He can edit me out.
Okay. He can edit you out. Okay. Anyway, this is a double set of books that Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan wrote called A Handbook of Jewish Thought. It's extremely important books. They're not so easy to come by. But I want to look at what Rabbi Kaplan is talking about, because what we want to look at is the different eras and the different names that are used concerning those sages of that era that were responsible for moving the oral Torah along, okay? So in Pirkei Avot, we've already seen what? We've already seen Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe received from Sinai the Torah, okay? And when it says the Torah, it means both written and oral, all right? Torah Shebiktav, written, Torah Shebe'al Peh, oral. Okay. Then he did what? He transmitted it, meaning he didn't lose anything. He transmitted what he received to Joshua. And then Joshua was able to transmit that to the elders. And the elders were able to transmit all of that, both the written and the oral Torah, to the prophets. And the prophets were able to transmit that to the men of the Great Assembly. Okay, and then we have Shimon HaTzadik, the last of the men of the Great Assembly. And Antigonus of Sochel, it goes back now to being received, meaning it wasn't able to be completely transmitted after that, okay? But it's not too bad. It's still not too shabby, I'm telling you. So Rabbi Kaplan tells us, this is on page 184 if you're looking for the page, Gwen. In 931, he says, the oral Torah was handed down by word of mouth from Moses to Joshua, then to the elders, the prophets, and the Great Assembly. The Great Assembly, he identifies it for us. What was that? It was the Sanhedrin, okay, that was led by Ezra the scribe at the beginning of the time of the Second Temple. And what that Sanhedrin did, that Great Assembly did, it undertook to actually enact, to make halakha, because they had been in exile for the first time ever, 70 years in Babylon. And they had been in exile, and they did not have a halakhic, a legal instruction on how to keep the Torah in exile. Okay? How to keep it, how to be a Jew not in the land of Israel. So this Sanhedrin, the men of the Great Assembly, undertook to enact legislation or to make the halakha that would make Judaism viable in the galut, in the diaspora. Because you know, very, very few Jews actually came back to the land of Israel at the end of the first exile. Okay. The Great Assembly, Rabbi Kaplan says, codified much of the oral Torah in a form that could be memorized by the students. All right? This codification, he says, was actually known as Mishnah. Mishnah. And he says one reason for this name was that it was meant to be reviewed. Reviewed, Shana. Mishnah means from the second, okay? Or, meaning you're going over it again and again and again. until it was memorized. And the word also, he says, denoted that the Mishnah was secondary, which is another play on words here, sheni, secondary to the written Torah. All right? But it's the explanations. It was required, he says, that the oral tradition be handed down, actually, word for word. Now we're going to find out exactly why we move from the transmission to now being received. Number one, the Jews aren't all in the land of Israel. We're operating in two different spheres here again now. We're in the Galut and a very small remnant back in the land of Israel. It was required the oral tradition be handed down word for word, exactly as it had been taught. The sages who taught this first Mishnah, they were known as Tanaim, a Tana, okay? And that is a term that describes the sages of the Mishnah. Hold on, I have what did I do? There it is. A Tana, actually, and I think it really goes before this, it's like from 100 BCE to 200 CE, okay? Or 100 BC to 200 AD, all right? These were the Tanaim. They were the sages of the Mishnah. This word comes, he says, actually from an Aramaic word, which is equivalent to the Hebrew word, this is the reason they are, to shana, which means to repeat, okay? So they were really still repeating the exact Mishnayot that they had learned. Although, he says, the oral Torah during that period was meant to be transmitted strictly by word of mouth. In fact, it was forbidden to be written. It was permissible for people to keep personal records. In other words, they took notes, okay? He says, therefore, many individuals would actually write down personal notes of what was being taught in the academies, all right? This, he says, was especially true of teachings that were not often reviewed. In other words, that they weren't going over all the time. Many also added, he said, marginal notes to the biblical scrolls that they used to study. And this is also where we find a whole lot of things in those ancient scrolls, is from notes that they would write in the margins of scrolls that they were using, not being read in the synagogue, but that they were using strictly for study in a Beit Midrash. All right? He says, likewise, the heads of these academies would keep written notes in order to preserve all of the traditions accurately. But since none of these notes were published, they were known, and you'll see them if you start studying this literature. They're referred to as Megillot Setarim, meaning scrolls that are hidden, okay? Hidden scrolls, because they weren't published. During the generations following the Great Assembly, the Mishnah developed into a program of study strictly for students to memorize. The actual Mishnah is not actually written down until the time of Judah the Prince, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, in 200 Common Era, 200 AD. Okay? So everything else up until that point, everything was being memorized, word for word. He said this was expanded often by new legislation, by case law, and all of this was known as the first Mishnah, or Mishnah Rishonah. As controversies began to develop, variations in the different Mishnayot, Mishnahs, of the various master sages began to appear. At the same time, the order of the Mishnah, he says, was improved, especially by Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva lived from the year 1 to 121 Common Era. Okay? Certain parts of the Mishnah, he says, were placed by Rabbi Akiva in almost their present form. At this time, however, he says no part of the oral Torah had actually been published. The only exception were some minor works as the scroll of fasts, Megillat Tanit, in other words, instructions on how to fast correctly. So he says the final and the most precise redaction of the Mishnah was made by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Judah the Prince. And let's see if he gives, it was in 200. This is the Mishnah, actually he says it was in 188. I'm off. It was in 188. He said in that redaction, he says, is the Mishnah that we have today as part of the Talmud. Okay? Now he wants to talk about all of these other things. We need to know all of this. The Mishnah, he says, consists of 6 orders. Okay? There are 6 different orders, or 6 big books of the Mishnah. In those 6 orders, they comprise 63 tractates, what is called a tractate. Let's see if he gives us, no he doesn't. Okay. In compiling his work, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi made use of all of the different earlier Mishnayot, the different Mishnahs, okay, which they were almost all exactly the same. There were just some arguments going on how this was and how that was. He condensed them and he decided, he said, among all of the disputed questions. The sages of his time, in other words, he didn't just take this upon himself and say, I'm the boss and this is the way it is. The sages of his time, in fact, this was actually our last Sanhedrin, actually, during his days. So the sages of his time all concurred with his decisions, and every one of them ratified his decisions whenever he made a decision to include something or to leave it out. However, he says, even rejected opinions, and this is something, if you're a scholar of the Talmud, you find that they don't all agree, but even an opinion that's rejected, it's still included in the text. It's still there, so it's still part of the tradition. It's still part of the oral Torah. And he says mainly so that they be recognized as such. In other words, that opinion is, we don't accept that opinion, so that those same questions and those same disputes would not be revived in later generations. He says there is a question as to when exactly the Mishnah was put in writing. Some authorities maintain that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi himself published it, but according to others, it was preserved orally until some generations even later than Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. So there's a question about that. There was a tradition in the oral Torah that if there was a danger that the oral Torah be forgotten, then it could be put in writing. Otherwise, it was absolutely forbidden to write it down. And this is what actually prompted Rabbi Judah Hanasi to put it down into writing. Because what he saw, the Roman persecution was so intense at that time, and he saw huge numbers of sages of Israel being killed with all their students, and he knew that they had parts of the oral Torah that no other community had. And so the idea was that it had to be put down into a written form just because of the danger of the times and the danger of the situation. He says this also implies that when there is a danger of the Torah becoming voided or forgotten, then it is a time, and he's quoting actually from Psalm 119, 126, which says, it's a time to work for God. It is a time to work for God, make void his Torah, which actually you can't even begin to understand unless you understand it the way the sages are understanding it. In other words, if his Torah is in danger of becoming void, in other words, nobody's studying it, nobody losing parts of it, whatever it is, then it's a time to work for God and remedy that situation. And that's the way he looked at it. He says, in any case, I'd never seen this before. Why did it have to take until 200? Listen to what the sages actually say about that. This is very interesting. No part of the oral Torah could actually have been put into writing until the nations had adapted the Bible, the Jewish Bible, into a religion of their own. Then the oral Torah would then be excluded by them, and it would remain uniquely Jewish and be able to be protected. Yeah, to be able to be protected. Otherwise, it could have been changed so much we wouldn't have it. That explains a whole lot. I never saw that before.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Can you say that again so we can take it?
It says, in any case, no part of the oral Torah could actually be put into writing until the nations had taken and adapted the Bible into a religion of their own. And the oral Torah would then be excluded by them and thus remain both uniquely Jewish, and it would be protected and wouldn't be able to be changed. Now listen to this, because these are other terms that you're going to run into. He says the tradition required the oral Torah be written under certain conditions. The commandment to write a Torah scroll also includes an obligation to either write or purchase books of Mishnah and Talmud containing the oral Torah. Besides the Mishnah, the Mishnah, these 6 books, orders of the Mishnah, other volumes were also compiled by the students of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi during the same period. Those other volumes include the Tosefta, The Tosefta also follows the orders of the Mishnah. It's the Tosefta to Yosef is to add something. So they were additions. They weren't part of the Mishnah, but they were additions that were added. Tosefta. As well as this is another commentary, Mekhilta. It's a commentary on the book of Exodus. You'll also hear this term, Sifra. Sifra is a commentary on the book of Leviticus. And Sifri is a commentary on Numbers and Deuteronomy. So anytime you hear those terms, Mishnah, Tosefta, Mechilta, Sifra, and Sifri, those are all works from that period of time, the commentaries that were written from that period of time. But the oral Torah that is in them is extremely ancient. All right? Works, he says, from outside Rabbi Yehuda's school. There were other works also that were written down, but they were from outside of his personal yeshiva. You'll hear these also. Baraita. A Baraita is another teaching from a Tana, A Tana, a Mishnaic sage. Not too long after this, the Jerusalem Talmud, the Talmud Yerushalmi, was compiled by Rabbi Yochanan, and we have 2 Talmuds, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud is much, much larger, and it's because what happened? Well, Israel, the Second Commonwealth, was short-lived. The Romans put a stop to it, So the academies that were in Babylon were much bigger, much better off, much more able to do the work than the Jews who were living in the land of Israel because of Roman persecution. All right? So the Yerushalmi Talmud is much smaller, the Babylonian is much larger, and it's the final authority, is the Babylonian Talmud. Okay, let's read on with Rabbi Kaplan for a little while. He's giving us background that we absolutely have to have. In ancient times, he says, the practice was for students first to memorize the basics of the oral Torah and then to carefully analyze their studies. During the period before Rabbi Yehuda, all of those memorized laws developed into the Mishnah, while the analysis of those laws, of those halakha, developed into a second discipline known as Gemara. Gemara is commentary on the Mishnah. Both of those things together, they make a Talmud. All right? A complete study. They make a Talmud. So we have the Yerushalmi, which has the Mishnah, and then the Gemara of the sages in the land of Israel. Then we have the Bavli, the Babylonian, which is the same Mishnah, the exact same Mishnah, but now because we have more sages, we have more freedom, we have a longer period of time, we have a lot more commentary from the sages in Babylon, And that makes a Talmud. The Gemara, he says, also the Gemara developed orally for some 300 years following the redaction of the Mishnah. So if we have the Mishnah put down around 200, so 300 years the rabbis are making all these comments and teaching on it, but they're not writing it down. It's still all being memorized, just their commentary on the Mishnah. Finally, he says, when that came into danger of being forgotten and lost, then Rav Ashi lived from 352 to 427, together with his school in Babylonia, undertook to collect all of these discussions, all of these different Gemara, and to put them in order. And Rav Ashi spent most of his life on that project together with his colleague. This is another Talmudic sage called Ravina. All right? After his death, his son, Bar Rav Ashi, continued the work along with another sage, Meramar. The Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud Bavli, was published in the year 505, finally put down into writing and published in the year 505 CE. The Babylonian Talmud was completed, it's not a complete thing, on only 37 of the 63 tractates of the Mishnah. Okay? So a little more than half of the Mishnah they covered in 300 years. Its main purpose was to clarify the Mishnah, establish which opinions are binding, provide derivations for the laws, discuss later legislation, provide homilies and stories to enhance the discussion. Now this is interesting. There were a total of 40 generations comprising 1,817 years, exactly 40 generations, from Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai. Moshe received the Torah from Sinai until the final redaction of the Babylonian Talmud. 40 generations. All right? The Babylonian Talmud was accepted by all Israel as the final binding authority in all questions of religion and Torah law. All subsequent codifications of Torah law are binding only insofar as they are based on the Talmud. To oppose even a single teaching of the Talmud is, according to the sages, to oppose God and His Torah. All right? Now he goes into, but I want to jump. He gives a whole list, by the way, of Tanaim. Well, he's showing the chain of tradition here. It's very interesting. Moshe, Joshua, Pinchas, and the elders, and those elders include Eli. You remember Eli the priest? Shmuel the prophet, Samuel, and King David. Then it moves to the prophets, Achiah, Eliyahu, Elisha, Jehoiada the priest, Zechariah ben Jehoiada, Hosea, Amos, Isaiah, Micah, Yoel, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Yirmiyahu, and Baruch ben Neriah. Then the Great Assembly, Ezra. The Great Assembly consisted of 120 elders, including Haggai the prophet, Zechariah the prophet, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Most people know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And Nehemiah, Mordecai, and Zerubbabel. And then Shimon the Tzaddik. Then the Tanaim begin with Antignos of Socho, was the first Tana. Then it goes on through Hillel and Shammai, Rabban Shimon ben Hillel, and Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. I'm not going to get where I want to go. I can't read all these names, but this would be a good thing. Maybe I'll make a list of these and give them to you, okay? I want to jump because it doesn't end there. He's talking about the Sanhedrin in the next chapter, but I want to move. Oops, I thought I marked the place. Maybe, yeah. So what happened after that? Because it actually doesn't end there. Now if we look at most, they're going to actually begin with a group of sages called the Geonim. Rabbi Kaplan is so on point here that he actually shows us there's another group in between there. So let me read from him, where I jump to page 236, Gwen, if you're looking. He says, the main work of the Talmud came to an end with the death of Ravina in 499 CE, so 500. This initiated the period of what was called the Savoraim, who made some additions to the Talmud and actually placed it in its final form. The period of the Savoraim lasted only for 90 years, until 589. They reached final decisions in all questions that had not been already decided in the Talmud. And since the Savoraim headed the academies, including all the sages of the time, their decisions are binding, just like those of the Talmud. Now we move again. Following the Savoraim came the period of the Geonim, okay? A Gaon, by the way, is a word we use for genius, all right? So the Geonim were the period of the geniuses, which lasted until the death of Rav Chai Gaon in 1038, okay? So they have a period of about 500 years, yeah, the Geonim. They headed the great academies of Sura and Pumbedita. I never can pronounce that. I always mispronounce it. Yeah. In Babylon. Sura and Pumbedita in Babylon, which had been founded in the times of the Talmud. The decisions of the Geonim were based on traditions from the masters of the Talmud and were almost universally accepted. Okay? With the end and the closing of the great Babylonian academies, which happened 1,000 years ago, there ceased to be any formally acknowledged center of Torah authority. But he says, however, numerous codes based on the Talmud and the decisions of the Geonim, they were compiled and published by leading rabbis, and so they have universal recognition within Judaism. He's going to give us, he says, most noteworthy among these were the codes of Rabbi Yitzhak Alfasi, Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel, who's also known as the Rosh. Rabbi Yitzhak Alfasi is called the Rif. These are different titles. As well as Yad HaHazakah of Rabbi Moshe Maimonides, the Rambam. He is in this time following that. He lived 1135 to 1204. The rabbis of that period were called Rishonim. This is another word you need to know. Rishonim, the first codifiers, in other words. They're bringing all of this stuff and making it available to people like us because we are not scholars of the Talmud. Okay? So the Rishonim began that process to move it down where normal people could begin to get it, sort of. Okay. The work, he says, that was most widely accepted, however, was the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch, written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, 1488 to 1575. That's also the time period of the Maharal. Okay. It took into account the Shulchan Aruch. We know what that is. I told you it's the set table. Okay. What he did was he brought everything down from the Talmud to tell us, okay, if I want to know how to keep Shabbat, then he sets it out for me. This is what you do to keep the Shabbat. If I want to know how to make a circumcision, he sets it out for us. He's bringing it from all the different sources to set it out for us. If I want to know how to do this, how to do that, he sets it out, okay? But since the Shulchan Aruch followed the practices of the Sephardim, a gloss was added to it by Rabbi Moshe Isserles, which included all the customs of the Ashkenazi, okay? And it's called the Mapah. Mapah is like the napkin, okay? On the table, on the set table, okay? With the publication of the Shulchan Aruch, the period of the Rishonim, so the Rishonim last another 500 years, came to an end, and the period of, you need to know this word, Acharonim, the later sages, or the later codifiers, began. So from the last 500 years has been the period of the Acharonim, the latter sages, okay? And I don't think we're going to have time to go into much more, but that gives us actually a very general outline of how the oral Torah came to us. All right, and it takes it beyond what's in Pirkei Avot because it ends just in the Mishnaic period. But it's still coming to us. That's the idea. It's still coming to us. It's not something dead and done and over with in a dusty book. It's still coming to us. Everything that we finished in our study with the Ramchal, it's all coming from the oral Torah. And he is one of the Acharonim. He is one of the latter commentators, one of the latter codifiers. Although the Maharal would be in the group of the Rishonim, the earlier, the first ones, okay? Okay. It's really going to be an amazing study. Now that we've got all that background stuff out of the way, we'll do our very best to start with what the men of the Great Assembly said. They said three things, okay? Be deliberate in judgment, develop many disciples, make disciples, and make a fence for the Torah. And that's where we will start. The next time we're together, we'll do the very best we can. But we kind of have it together in our heads how all this went and how all it came, and how actually unbelievably important it is, and that we need it so much. We absolutely need it so much. Now we just have to learn it. So it's only taken 3,500 years to come to us, so we'll have to get after it, because I don't think we have 3,500 years to learn it all. Okay, so we'll begin to learn it the next time we're together. Okay. Toda Rabbah. Shalom Uvracha. Peace and a blessing. Bye.